Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to our 14th Coffee with EMBL session. For everyone who's joining us for the first time, welcome. For everyone else, welcome back. It's great to see everybody. We've got another very interesting discussion session lined up, and we are particularly keen to involve as many people as possible in the discussion. So we have a number of topics we are interested to discuss today, affecting all of our lives. And I would just like to say at the start of this discussion that while many of us who are based in Europe and in Northern Europe are feeling finally a little bit more confident about the trajectory of the pandemic and our possibility for unlocking our societies, I would like just to empathize with our many colleagues who are not in Europe at the moment, who are at a different stage of the pandemic trajectory. We're very conscious, especially of people in South America and in India and other parts of Asia, for whom the pandemic is currently at its peak. And our thoughts are very much with you. And that's one of the topics and themes I feel is very important for our ongoing discussion and thoughts, is how we can deal with a truly global problem when our influence tends to exert itself at a national level. So we would hope to explore some facts about the emergence of the pandemic and how it's unfolding. I mean, I think many of us are wondering, what has happened that has made the second wave, or possibly you might even think of it as the third wave, more damaging to many of our societies? And how did that happen? What is the role of variants, and how worried should we be about the emergence of new variants? Can they evade the vaccines that are now available? How should we cope with that? And 1 year ago, we were discussing in Coffee with EMBL the possibility of whether a vaccine would be made against human coronavirus, because that was not taken for granted as something that was guaranteed. And yet that seems to have been rather successful. I mean, spectacularly successful, we might say, in terms of the speed and effectiveness of the vaccines, although there are still pushback in some of our countries against people not wanting to use the vaccination. So that's something else that would be really useful to learn about. And we have here amongst us two really famous virologists who are going to be talking about this. And I'm sure in the audience there are other people who are expert in this area who can contribute. And then amongst the social consequences of the pandemic, we're also wanting to discuss why it appears to be that some regions or nations have coped with the emerging situation better than others. That's not something we want to address as a competition between nations, but something to learn from, to understand, so we can be better prepared in future. Okay, so these are some of the topics we're hoping to discuss today. And I'd like to bring in, first of all, to the discussion, Peter Rottier. Many of our regular attendees at Coffee with EMBL will remember Peter's contributions from our first Coffees with EMBL. Peter is one of the world's leading human coronavirus experts. And it was certainly a highlight for me in our Coffee with EMBL last year to listen to Peter and learn from his experience. And so, Peter, thank you for joining us again. Great to see you.
Yes, here I am.
Fantastic. Good to see you. You're looking well.
Certainly. Thank you.
So it's 1 year later. We are here. The situation has evolved. We're not out of the woods yet, but there's a lot of things that we have a lot more data than we did a year ago. And I'm really interested to hear, as I'm sure many people are, to hear from you and to ask your opinion. I mean, what do we know more about the trajectory of the pandemic? Has it evolved as you expected, or has it been a surprise to you?
Right. Well, I think there are a few surprises. One of the first surprises that I have is that the variants that we see, and that came up in I think the first one was in the UK, it was in autumn of last year, I found it very late for these variants to occur. Actually, there is one mutation in the spike protein that some people may have heard. It's a mutation from aspartic acid to glycine at position 614. That is a mutation that came up early in 2020, and that has been maintained, and that is now present globally in all viruses. But apart from that one mutation, we did not see many mutations, say, during the first 3/4 of a year, which is very surprising, because if you imagine a virus coming from either a bat or an intermediate host into a new host species, the human species, you would expect early to see adaptive mutations that the virus selects for to be better able to infect and spread. That is, apart from this one mutation I mentioned, that is not what we see. It took months, almost a year from, well, if you consider November 2019 as the start of the epidemic, it took almost a year for these variants, as we call them, to occur. So that was very surprising, and well, you may have, I won't go deep into that, but there are different theories that you can think of to explain this. One is the theory I do not favor, which is that the virus was already adapted to human cells in a laboratory and escaped or was brought out of that.
So that is still a pervasive theory that's not gone away, and it would be very helpful for us as scientists looking for fact-based explanations. What is the evidence, if any, that supports that? I guess you've just highlighted it. Is that a plausible scenario or not really?
Well, it is. In theory, it's a plausible scenario, and it's very hard to prove something until there is really evidence. So far, there is no real evidence. Looking at the sequence of the coronavirus, experts who are better to judge on that than we have concluded that there are no scars or indications in the viral genome that point to human hands having manipulated the virus. And also, from my personal perspective, I know this laboratory in Wuhan, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, very well. I have collaborated with them from 2003 after the first SARS outbreak, and I was still there in 2019 in October, just before the outbreak came up. So I know the people in the institute. Most of them, especially the senior people there, they have their trainings in European and American laboratories. They are they have they have the skills, but they have the attitudes like we have them. They are fundamental virologists, and I do not. From my personal experience with them, I do not suspect them to have this kind of hidden agenda.
It could of course be. I'm not suggesting this came out of a laboratory. I have no evidence.
No.
I'm obviously just interested, but at the same time, I think it's important as scientists that we don't discount possible facts just because we don't want them to be true. The only comment I was going to make was that in the UK, I can't remember exactly, maybe 15 or 16 years ago, there was a tragic situation where foot and mouth disease virus came, and that was coming out of a laboratory, but it wasn't because someone was developing a bioweapon. It was an accident. It was a leaking pipe.
Yeah.
And so there can be an origin that comes from legitimate research on something, which it may be politically inconvenient to admit to. That doesn't have to be that you're making a malicious, a bioweapon, but it still could be that there was.
Right. Yeah. Well, the problem is that China is not giving access to researchers, because you would like to know from the laboratory notes and from the databases of viruses that are in the laboratory, to know which viruses have been there and have been worked on, especially in the month before the virus broke out. So that is not helping, giving us an objective idea. But my view is that until there is no evidence, I just park this idea aside.
Sure.
Absolutely. So okay. So that could have been one reason why the virus didn't mutate so much in the initial period. A second reason might be that the virus has been circulating among humans, but in an avirulent phenotype. We do not know that. It might have become virulent at some point and then surfaced to our attention. So that might be the case. And a third option would be that the virus has been in an intermediate host between bats and humans, an intermediate host with features that are already quite similar to humans. We have no further evidence on that.
Is bat the most likely species that it came from?
Yes, that is still the most likely species. The closest relative of SARS-CoV-2 in animals is a bat coronavirus that has been detected in 2013 by researchers from this Wuhan Institute. The evolutionary distance between that bat virus and the human virus is too long to explain an immediate jump from the bat to the human. And there is additional experimental evidence that supports this view that this bat virus has not jumped immediately to humans. So there has to be more. So that is one aspect which surprised me, that the virus didn't mutate earlier. And then we saw from September, November or so last year, we saw the UK variant. We saw later the South African, the Brazilian, the Californian, and we have now the Indian. And we call those variants because they are viruses that suddenly have accumulated a number of mutations. Usually, when you see the gradual evolution of a virus, which means that you see one mutation and a second one, and they are maintained, and you may see accumulation then, but you see a path from the original virus to the one with multiple mutations. Now we do not see those intermediates, but we see the variants. Some, like the UK variant, I think it had 14 mutations, different from the immediate precursor that we know. So that indicates that the way they have evolved is quite special, and it's remarkable that we see that for all these different variants. And well, we have no explanations, no really proven explanations. The idea is that these variants have emerged in individuals that are immune suppressed, and in which the virus can replicate within one host and accumulate mutations because the host, this immune compromised or immune suppressed person, cannot completely eliminate the virus. So that gives the virus space, so to say, to evolve and accumulate a number of mutations, which then, if they are able to transmit from that person into the population, may have or may not, but in the cases that we see, they have an advantage. And usually the advantage is that they bind better to the ACE2 receptor, that they thereby transmit better, that the viral load that they induce in the infected people is higher, so that droplets that normally have 10 viral particles, for instance, by an infection with these variants may have 100 or so.
So Peter Vicker, can you shed any light for what to me, I think for many people has been a surprise, that when we look at the situation, for example, in India, I have to say I was surprised last year that the pandemic didn't seem to, explode more in India, and yet now it looks like it's a terrible situation and really a tragic situation. I had expected to see that like a year ago. Why is that happening now? What is it about? Is it a special variant that is causing that, or do we have an explanation for why it's taken a year in India to really go like this?
Yeah. Well, I must admit, I don't have an explanation as well. There is little information, quality information about the viruses that are circulating there. There are some variants that have been detected, but they have not been studied in sufficient detail to say anything about it, I think. So it's whether it is cultural or a way. The reason is lays in the fact how the government have dealt with the infection or not. I just don't know. So I hope someone in the audience has ideas about that.
Yeah.
So I can't explain.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely looks like very different trajectories across South America, across Europe, across Asia. Certainly, Ari, I don't know. We have another world-famous virologist with us. Ari, is that something that you can explain for us? Is it to do with allelic differences in populations in the human population or other situations?
So I looked up this Indian, it's 617. It has 3 mutations, and when people have looked at it, these mutations exist in the same places in other viruses, but it doesn't look, from the basic science that I can read, as if it would be very much worse than some of the other mutants. The worst one apparently is the one in South Africa, because it has a very so it can avoid many antibodies better than the others. So, Peter, don't you think you have probably also thought about this, that it's not clear why this virus spreads on the basis of the actual mutations so badly? There is a huge difference, of course, in how the societies deal with these things. I can only look at, I'm now sitting on an island in Finland, where they have been able from the beginning to keep the COVID-19 level very low. Our neighbor, Sweden, has a completely different policy, although very similar societies otherwise. And their incidence of COVID-19 is actually double of that, what is now almost double of that, which is now in India. So it depends very, very much on how the countries are dealing with what decisions are made. And I'm sure that's a big factor here too.
Is there a clear linkage between rate of infection and the clinical consequence of the infection? Are those things always linked? That the more the more transmission there is, the worse the clinical outcome, or could they be two separate things? I mean, a variant could be clinically more dangerous, but actually not transmitted as much, or vice versa.
So it hasn't been very much studied, except for the British, the B117, where it's very clear that its transmission is much better, probably, as Peter said, because it binds more with higher affinity to the receptor. And there is also evidence there that the amount of severe cases is higher for that virus. But I don't think it's so clear for the Indian version yet, except there is a paper came out earlier this week, which suggests that it also has a higher propensity for severe cases than the original wild type virus.
Maybe Peter, also I can ask you that this is maybe a more trivial question, but it's one I've wondered about. When we talk about, originally there was a lot of political controversy about calling this a Chinese virus because it was stigmatizing China. But now we're talking about South African, British viruses, Indian virus. Is the nomenclature based on where the variant was first identified, or based on some other, where it was first sequenced, or what? Where do these names come from?
Well, these names like Indian and UK are just because they are, these names are used because they are handy, because they refer to the place where the viruses come from. Within the coronavirology, say that the taxonomy scene, there is reluctance to refer to viruses to the place where they derive from, because as for the Chinese virus, it's stigmatizing, and so it's not preferred. But in everyday life, it is easier to talk about it this way. So people do it. I did it. But there are ways to give them acronyms or numbers, as is now the case. But these numbers do not really help in the conversation as we are doing it here.
And I'm sure a lot of people are also concerned about the possible relationship between a new variant that emerges and resistance to the vaccines that are now available. What is the realistic chance that a new variant will evade the vaccines that we have?
That chance is not so big. These vaccines will protect to certain levels, and the variants may escape from them to certain levels. But we do not have, we know, for instance, that one of the mutations, E484K, that occurs in the South African and the Brazilian variant, it affects an epitope, and it leads to less protection by the antibody responses. But we have to remember that protection by the vaccines is not only governed by the humoral immune response, the antibodies, but we are lucky in this case that there are a number of T cell responses, both CD4 plus T helper, T follicular helper cells, CD8 T cell epitopes, which occur in the spike protein, and which appear to contribute to protection additionally. And those seem to be less vulnerable to the mutations as we see them.
Okay, I'd just like to bring in Thomas.
Yeah, so I was wanting to come back a bit on the India issue, because I think one thing that is incredible to think about is that it's a massive country with high densities, and I think the societal behavior that we have seen probably have not changed much considering, last year and this year. So I was really wondering, since it's a huge country, it's 1 billion people plus, if there's somebody in the audience that locally could comment on a few things, for instance, is it the density or the behavior of the people something that might have made the difference between last year and this year? Is the situation, locally all bad, or we are looking at hot spots? Because, if we plot the number as, cynical as it may seem, on a 1.5 billion people country, the numbers are not that huge. And I say this with a lot of respect. So I wanted to see whether in the audience there was somebody that could give us a perspective on these few points.
Yeah, I don't know if HP could maybe comment, or if there's someone else who could.
Yeah, I would like to present there and describe the reason of high incidence and then disease prevalence of this new variant Indian population. And I think this is also because of the population, as Thomas rightly pointed out, and we had too many of the population and too much of the crowd, and it was kind of expected that if this virus comes to India comes to the stage 3, that is called community transmission, this was kind of expected, because if you live more close, if you come to India where the population is much more than, I think, 9 to 10 times higher than any country in Europe. So this is a kind of inevitable social aspect of the disease, and I think it is also linked to the change of the microbiome, in the lung in Indian population, and also it could be a kind of cross-reactivity of the Indian patient, which are already carrying the BCG vaccination that initially prevented the spread of the death rate, but now it is not able to do so, and it is probably a kind of mutational manifestation of the mutation which is taking place in the variant available in India at much faster rate. And there is another aspect, that many Indian patients may have some homozygous mutation in the type 1 interferon gene. So that is also a kind of the issue which is discussed in Indian funding body and Indian scientific community, and people are working, how this type 1 mutation and lack of the type 1 interferon signaling in the Indian population is contributing to the disease pathology. But it is all basically, beating around the bush, but we haven't got the actual answer why there is a very high prevalence of the death rate and infection of this new variant, which is available. But that is actually what I can predict, and I would like to comment on. Yeah.
Okay. So I think this is something new to me. I hadn't realized there was a strong correlation between BCG vaccination and protection. Is that something, Peter or Ari or Thomas, or is that well established? The BCG vaccine. That's sort of new for me.
For me too.
It was a hypothesis that last year, somewhere in the middle of last year, that BCG might work, might have an immune stimulating effect that lasts longer than what we see, for instance, as when we use a normal adjuvant that can temporarily activate the immune system. BCG was thought to help by installing this alarmed immune system for a longer period. And there has been quite a large trial in the Netherlands and other countries where they have tested this BCG vaccine, but they could not show that it was really improving the chances of people getting infected. So it is no longer used as a potential preventive measure.
Okay, I'd like to bring in Kelly, who's raised his hand. I believe he's joining us from Canada. Kelly, are you available?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say exactly the same thing. BCG is great for priming an immune response to just about anything. So that'll give you some level of protection in a very general way. But it is interesting that the cells that seem to be responding to the virus quickest are these mate cells, these invariant T cells. And those are interesting because they're known to respond to bacterial products and expand. And people with expanded population of those cells seem to do really well with the COVID infections. And it also has a sex bias, which might explain why some of the men are doing worse than the women.
And is the molecular basis for the gender bias clear or?
Not completely clear. What's odd is that in females, they seem to have a population of these mate cells that respond quicker and with a better antiviral response, whereas men, they seem to be kind of lazy and dumb.
I will make no comment about that for obvious reasons. So, I mean, I guess when we're thinking about vaccination programs, I remember, Peter, when we were discussing this a year ago, we were just worrying collectively that maybe we shouldn't be betting our collective house on getting a vaccine ready, because it was a proposition that wasn't obvious would definitely work. There was a risk of what you pointed out. There hadn't been successful human coronavirus vaccines developed. It's the fact that we now have these vaccines, I think, is first of all a fantastic success for science. It must raise a lot of questions. It makes me think that actually, that this concept, necessity is the mother of invention. When we focus our minds and you have to do something, actually, it was easier to make the vaccines than maybe you would have thought. And I wonder how many other diseases or morbidities, if you put that amount of effort and concentrated minds, we could make faster progress with. But I find it inexplicable why in many of our countries, so many people won't take the vaccine. And that also raises a lot of interesting questions. And it's something else that I think is worth thinking about. Is that a failure of our scientific community to communicate clearly with people about the risk benefits? I leave that for people to reflect on. I see that Margaret has her hand up. Would you like to contribute, please?
Yeah, I actually have it is related. So one of the things that I was very astonished about is that the vaccine, at least in the US, it is said that someone who's had COVID should still get the vaccine, and that the vaccine is better than having had the disease. I've noticed, I just recently traveled to Germany. In Germany, they seem to consider recovered COVID cases similar to vaccinated people, which is not how we are doing it in the US. So in Germany, it's like if you've had COVID, if you've recovered from COVID or been vaccinated, certain rates are applying. And to me, like I'm one of the old generation that has had measles and cough, the whooping cough, and all these things. And my university wanted to test me recently because I don't have vaccination. And of course, 60 years later, I still have super high antibodies. And my impression is for measles and these diseases, it is true that having had the disease protects your lifetime, and the vaccine is a little bit more shaky. And here it seems to be the opposite. Do we know why?
Yeah, maybe I can say about a few things about it. The surprise that that all the vaccines work so well comes from our ignorance at the start about and expectations at the start about vaccines against coronaviruses, because one of the observations was that infections by our well-known human coronaviruses, of which we have 4 or 5, do not protect us against secondary subsequent infections later during life. So that was one reason why we did not expect great success in advance. Other observations was that there were, or other reasons were that there were no good vaccines against any other coronavirus, except for one chicken coronavirus that was produced by serial passaging on eggs, a very old procedure, which is used in the field still, but doesn't work very well. Other vaccines were not vaccine candidates were not successful. For instance, I worked with porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. There, spike or inactivated vaccines or other forms of vaccines that elicit humoral response, antibody responses only, do not protect. I've worked with feline infectious peritonitis virus. I explained that last year. When you vaccinate with the vaccinia virus recombinant expressing the spike protein, and you after the vaccination with that vaccine candidate, you come back with the virulent virus, you get an enhanced infection, and the cats, in this case the animals, the cats, they do not die after 3 or 4 weeks, but within 10 days under really terrible circumstances. So the expectations were low in the beginning, and then we saw that actually all these vaccines against SARS-CoV-2 that were based on the spike protein protected wonderfully. And well, we know now that it is both the antibodies and the T cell responses that do this work. And whether you give it by mRNA or by vectors or as inactivated virus, it all seems to work. So, of course, some better than others, but they appear to work. And coming back to the lady, I don't remember the name, but she referred to other infections where once you have undergone an infection, you are protected for life, at least for against serious disease. Maybe not infection, but certainly against serious disease. That is so for many viruses, isn't it, Ari?
Yeah. Yes. Nothing to add. There is evidence that the vaccination now with these up-to-date vaccines give you a better protection than a mild case of COVID-19, which means that in the States, as was mentioned, they decide to go ahead and vaccinate also people who have had COVID. And I think that is probably what most other countries also do, because you get an enhancement and you get the evolution of the best antibodies after the vaccination in that case as well.
Yeah. So a couple of people with their hands up. Kelly, I saw you first, and then also Uli after that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so it's not just antibody modification by somatic hypermutation, but the second dose, and that's going to be the vaccination in the case of people who've already been infected. It really gives you a whopping memory response. It causes the plasma cells to move to the bone marrow and take up long-term residence, and they start living forever then. That's why a measles vaccine works forever. So you really want to have the second dose, particularly with this virus, in order to get long-term memory and prevent you from needing to getting infected again, which people have been seeing in people who got a natural infection. So that was one thing. And then I have to leave soon, so I'm going to apologize if I hijack this. But does anybody have any information on long hauler syndrome? Because this virus is weird. It really seems to pull autoimmune antibody clones out of the woodwork. And there's so many people seeing these kind of odd autoimmune-like syndromes in long haulers. But I'd be really worried about people who've had mild infections, but then later show things later after the infection.
Anyone's got an answer, please put it in the comments or get in touch. Uli, would you like to join in?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really enjoying this. I have two questions regarding the vaccinations and the mutations that are arising. And I'm asking this because I'm involved in sequencing all of the mutations here in Austria. And so the first one is that there's a lot of concern in Austria that because of us finding the South African cluster in Tyrol initially, there was a huge vaccination attempt in Tyrol, and exactly out of that vaccination attempt, exactly in that region, we now see the E484K mutation appearing in the background of B117 in super high numbers, actually. And so people here are wondering whether sort of in this time where people were building up their immune response, but many people were positive for B117, and I'm saying thousands or so, whether that basically prompted this E484 to come up. That's one question. And the other question I would have is, I'm still positively surprised by how immunogenic the spike protein is. And I'm wondering whether it has to do with the fact that this virus recently jumped the species barrier and hasn't learned yet to sort of live in a stealth mode relative to our immune system as good as possible. If you're vaccinating against influenza, it's actually not working as well. And I wonder whether this virus hasn't sort of lost all the edges to our immune system yet, and that a future derivative of it will actually be only as well vaccinated against as another typical respiratory disease.
Yeah, that's a really important, interesting point. When I wind the clock back also to our discussion a year ago about what's the prospect of getting a virus, we were all very aware also of other situations like hepatitis virus, where 40 years later we still don't have vaccines, or other examples for viruses. Is there a danger that the success in so quickly getting a virus to COVID-19 will make governments assume that if a new epidemic arises to some new type of virus, well, we just snap our fingers and we throw some money and then we have a vaccine? That's another question I worry about. That maybe we've been incredibly lucky, perhaps for reasons that Uli was mentioning. In this case, which is great. If we're lucky, we'll take that, but let's not draw the wrong conclusions. Either the pharma industries have just suddenly got magically better at making vaccines, and maybe technology has changed and that's helped, but maybe not. That's another interesting thing. Also the as well as the science and the clinical aspects of the immune response, there's also the psychological aspects. Some people are not accepting vaccines, not because they think they've got enough, humoral or cellular immunity, but rather because they think Bill Gates is going to be putting microchips, or President Trump told them not to do it, or it's all a government plot to manipulate them, or they're going to get a blood clot, even if the chance of that is less than the chance of getting a blood clot on a transatlantic flight, which they wouldn't think twice about. I despair sometimes about these issues, but the other thing I think it would be nice to spend a little time commenting on is it. Well, we do have a situation. I worry about a situation developing where we almost have vaccination apartheid, where you have some countries being very successful in developing this, some people feeling, right, we're now protected, so rather than solve the problem at a global level, we'll just build a wall with passports and certificates for the people who are protected. That's not the world personally I want to live in. And I'm really interested in people's opinions or comments about how do we get away from the idea of our politicians always treating this as a sporting competition. Oh, Spain is doing better than Italy, or Italy is doing better than France, and Germany is doing better than, well, Britain's the worst usually. And, we're all having, we're treating it as if it's a zero-sum game, whereas actually we need to approach this as a global community and all be in this together, right? It's not enough to solve the problem in Europe or in Germany alone or in Finland alone. I mean, maybe the Nordic countries, Ari, are doing much better than some other places. I'm not sure about the statistics, but I think that's not the lesson we want to draw from this, is to say we're better than you, but how do we learn together so that we all do a better job in future? And I wonder if there's anyone in the audience who is involved in patent law or could comment on the most recent dispute about trying to, have pharma companies leave aside patents in this case, because it shouldn't be about making money. It should be about getting as many people globally vaccinated as possible. If anyone here is working in that area who would like to comment, that would be great. Meanwhile, I'd like to bring in Giorgio from who's working at Imperial College in London, but who's been very active in social media about some of these issues and has some direct experience of researching comparatively how it's been approached in different countries. Giorgio, could you share your thoughts with us?
So, hi, everyone. So that's a couple of things that I wanted to add to the discussion, which I found very interesting. Mainly, the first one is really that I think one aspect that has been missing in the global discourse and discussion about the virus is that we have not talked enough about the evolutionary aspects of it. And we've talked a lot about how the evolution shapes, for instance, the different residues, right? And how this amino acid change and spike and this and that, but not about how the pressure that we put on the virus will make it change. What are our behavior? How does our behavior contribute to the future of the virus? So, for instance, when Peter was saying about the first mutation and D614G, it's worth noticing that in the past 3 months, we have had 50% of the cases of contagions that we had since at the beginning of the pandemics. So it's kind of expected that now the number of variants will increase dramatically because the contagion has reached a level that it's never been seen before. And this considering that we're probably heavily underestimating the number of cases in India and probably in South America. And in this sense also connects to what we were saying about immune escape, right? So far, everyone has been doing either pseudovirus analysis or plague analysis, looking for variants that might escape the vaccines or the immune system in general. But the virus has not encountered that kind of pressure yet, just simply because there are not enough people around who either had the infection or had the vaccine. And so there is not been yet this kind of pressure to shape the virus into a form that actually has a huge advantage from escaping the effect of vaccines. And so I think this is what we should then, it's been maybe our worry about escapers has been a bit premature. They might happen maybe in an area like Manaus in Brazil, or maybe in some places of South Africa where particularly crowded, you might reach something that looks like herd immunity, which then starts putting pressure on the virus, but it's definitely not been a global phenomenon so far. And now with the rollout of vaccinations, it definitely will be a global phenomenon, because now the virus will meet a completely new kind of evolutionary pressure. And I think this has not been discussed enough with the public. From my point of view, I try to look at this from the evolutionary perspective, because that's what my scientific interest is. I was dragged a little bit into the social discussion on Twitter, particularly on the interface between the UK and Italy. It's been very interesting to see how different countries reacted differently at all levels, the political level, but also the societal level. This virus behaved very differently, even in its current and actual shape. It might behave differently between countries. So, for instance, the B117 variant, the famous Kent variant, the English variant, behaved in a way in December in the UK, which was very dissimilar from Italy or France and Germany later on, even though the behavior were not that dramatically different. And when it comes to the Indian variant, for instance, what actually surprises me the most is not the outbreak that is currently going on in India, but actually the fact that the previous outbreak did relatively little damage. And so that is actually what confuses me. Why did the first outbreak vanish without any major? Because definitely there was a first outbreak. It's not like India was like Australia or New Zealand, right? They had a first outbreak, but suddenly it vanished. And it vanished by keeping the same distancing and social measures that they are keeping basically now, actually much milder than the ones they are having now. So there are, I think, many things we don't understand still about the behavior of the virus. For instance, how my change with climatic conditions. It's possible that this Indian variant, for instance, might gain the ability to spread better in hot climates. So if that's the case, it might be, a bad timing for it because it reaches the hemisphere during the summer. So there are several aspects which I think are unexplored, and others maybe that are overexplored, right? We especially from the point of view of communication with the public, we have focused way too much on things like vaccine efficacy. We've given numbers of vaccine efficacy to the second digits after the period, right? Like 91.5. And some people found themselves in a situation where they rather have Pfizer because they think Pfizer has a higher efficacy, even though we don't really understand what the efficacy of this vaccine eventually means, because at the end, what you want is to be protected from the symptomatology. And so efficacy, the role of amino acidic residues. Right now, every my neighbor is familiar with mutation in the lysine 484 or things like this. These are probably details that have been received too much attention, and other aspects, like for instance how the human behavior is shaping evolutionary pressure, have received perhaps little attention. This is my take so far.
Is there any correlation, do you think, and this is a very naive question from me, with no, I hope it's not misinterpreted, but between science education and how different areas of science have responded in terms of people's training or education to understand information about efficacy, what to do, what's happening. I don't know what lessons we should be drawing from this, if there's a pattern yet.
I think what really shaped the public opinion from the very beginning was actually not the pandemics in itself, not the biological aspects, not the virus, it was the lockdowns. This is really what made the difference from the public point of view, is the lockdowns. So the countries who went with a very strict lockdown at the beginning had most divisive behavior in the population. The countries that were lucky because they found the lockdown at the right point or because they stuck with it, like the ones that eventually went for COVID-0, China, Australia, New Zealand, there is no division there, and there is no doubt there on how the virus should be tackled. So the public just completely bought that system, and they're happy with it, and they went with it. In Europe, especially where the lockdowns were so dramatic, so divisive, so politically loaded, that was shaped 90% of the response of the public. It's not their scientific preparedness, it's really just the politics towards lockdown and how they saw it. And you can see it even in the Scandinavian countries, right? I mean, Peter was comparing Finland to Sweden. It's not like those people have a different scientific education or anything, but it's the way they reacted to the first lockdown and the way that the lockdown was sold to them. Even the way how the politics has basically taken the position regarding the lockdown. So, for instance, Sweden is probably the only country in the world where it's the right wing who is pushing for the lockdown, and the left wing is actually against, because that's what how they started, and they went down that path. Everywhere else, every other country in the world is usually tend to be the other way around. Is the right wing wants to move away from lockdowns, and the left wing is actually more conceptually for lockdown. So all these aspects have nothing to do with scientific education. I think there is really one of those cases where, again, political and in general bipolar division of society played the role.
Interesting. Thomas, you.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to also pick up on one of Giorgio's points, because I think in terms of communication, this has been quite a learning curve also for the scientists. And I think also the problem was a little bit of the idea of communication that a scientist has. And I mean, we don't reflect on that because we are very much all scientists and we are very much into the detail. But, the point is that the public is not used to dealing with the details in absence of a general background. So, for instance, the idea of, any vaccine would be better than no vaccine at all. So it's completely pointless to discuss whether one is even 80% or 95% has not come across. And I think this is also because, when you ask a scientist, they will always comment on the latest news saying, okay, this is about the detail of this and that, without making, a premise about, anything that I tell you is far less important. And if you want to know it is good, then, the vaccine is much better than no vaccine. And I think we are seeing a lot of that in the interface between the scientists and the public. I think one challenge is how to communicate science effectively with telling the truth, but with the right sort of hierarchy, and also how to nudge people with politics that can be interesting and novel. I mean, I think one example we were discussing before this meeting was whether the idea of the states of lifting the mask mandate is really just because they are sort of weird or they want to anticipate a transition that will be there, or it's really one way to nudge people to now go out and vaccinate at the time where the vaccination prone people are already vaccinated, and now you have to dig out the others. So there's a lot of these aspects that I think are very, very important and underestimated.
I agree with you. I mean, another thing that I think is of interest is how this is going to affect different societies where, for example, healthcare systems are organized differently. So in most of Europe, we have a socialized medicine system where, in general, healthcare of a level is provided regardless of how much money you've got. There's the concept of doing that. I mean, in North America, that's not necessarily the situation. Is this going to create another level of inequality, or in terms of providing access to protection from coronavirus or any other sort of serious virus, according to whether you've got a good healthcare plan or not? Or how is that playing out in America? I don't know if anyone is online who feels able to comment on that, because it would seem to me if it is being approached particularly under the new Biden administration, we just vaccinate everyone and we don't charge anybody. How do you not go from that to then saying, well, if you'll do that for coronavirus, why won't you provide the social medicine protection to everybody in other situations? And then I'm very interested if anyone's here who might like to comment on that. If anyone else would like to bring up again this issue about the debate around patents. I see a few comments are emerging about this. I mean, what do we think about that? I don't know if that's something, Thomas or Giorgio, you also have it.
Yeah, two things. So regarding the first aspect about the socialization of medicine and the response, I think it's important to remind that CDC was born exactly for this purpose. CDC was a social organization. It was born to fight the spread of malaria in the United States. So the United States were very quick at recognizing 60, 70 years ago that actually, if you want to do public health, you have to do public health in a socialized way. You cannot do it in the free market way, because it's not it just doesn't give you enough incentive in that way, right? And so whether they will learn this lesson and move in that way, I have no idea. It's really just a political outlook. Definitely, it's not just about the healthcare. For instance, it's clear that one key aspect is isolation in case you are positive, right? Either with or without symptoms. You need to have an incentive to stay home from work in order to isolate yourself. And that's something that the United States have not done. The UK have done this quite well, of course, with a lot of economic burden, but they had a furlough scheme. And the stimuli that the United States had were very different, were more like postdoc. And so how the countries deal with that is also very different. I think with hindsight, probably I would have predicted even more cases in the United States, given these circumstances, than they had. Having said this, I think it was kind of paradoxical that they, at the end of the day, the States were the one country that actually invested the most money into the research for vaccine and other, because obviously Trump was very keen in being reelected, and so he put a lot of money through the Warp Speed program, and maybe that's where the EU failed. So in practical sense, it happens the opposite. The United States put a lot of money into social stimulus toward research, and the EU put much less money into it.
Yeah, there's a good question from Niovi. I just saw posted. Niovi, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yes, thank you, Angus. I was just wondering about the cost of the possible need of yearly national vaccinations. I mean, how long can countries keep paying for vaccines so that people get them for free? Can we afford to switch that to people having to pay, and will that have the impact of curbing the vaccination drive?
So, yeah, that's a great question. Can we afford to pay for it? Can we afford not to pay for it? You could ask the question both ways. Coming back to, again, maybe Peter, Ari, or anyone else, if you'd like to comment. I guess we've had that experience with flu, where many countries, I think, now give at least some vulnerable sections of the population's flu. I mean, I guess there's an economic argument that if the people don't need acute medical care, it saves you money in the long term, apart from the ethical one of just protecting your people so they don't get sick and die. I hate to make it sound like it has to be only money that we're thinking, but I realize, we have to pay for these things. So actually, I see Jennifer has her hand up. Jennifer, would you like to comment?
It was just around the question about patenting. And basically, there's been, I would say that some of the concerns raised about patenting from Pfizer and from others is that it won't necessarily speed up vaccine production, and that just allowing people patents without all the underlying know-how is not necessarily effective. And there was concerns that if others start producing vaccines without proper know-how, then there could be problems with safety and efficacy of these other sort of like Me Too vaccines, copycat vaccines.
Jen, can I ask you, if I understand correctly, Jennifer, you are a patent lawyer, is that correct?
I'm a solicitor dealing in intellectual property as opposed to a patent.
Okay.
I don't write patents. I deal with them.
But compared to me, I suspect most of the people taking part, you're definitely an expert in this area. Here's a crazy idea off the top of my head. Why can't we take some? I mean, I fully understand the reason why we have patents, and in fact, Brian Sproul, who's here, and my first ever patent was with Brian when we were working in Heidelberg. I don't think I made any money from it, but it was my first experience of patenting things. And I understand the arguments about encouraging research and development and protecting investment in research and development of the patent system. But do we have to have a patent system apply to everything? Could we perhaps say, maybe a lesson from this is that certain things of huge global importance transcend the value of conventional product development? I mean, if you patent, a new smartphone, it's great if we all have a new smartphone, but, to be honest, it's not the same thing as saving people's lives around. Am I just being idealistic, or is that?
No, there is already a lot of patent law around things that are deemed essential, that the governments can temporarily get around patent laws. But what I think a lot of the farmers are saying is that coming off patent won't necessarily speed up vaccine production, because there's a limited supply of some of the components. And if they start getting used up by others that want to come in, because of course, if it goes off patent, the others who are producing extra vaccines won't necessarily make them free of charge. So there might be others buying up components, so that the Pfizers and Modernas and that may not get the components that they need to actually make the vaccines. You're also sort of spreading production thin across multiple places. And there's other alternatives too that you can look at. So for instance, AstraZeneca collaborated with the Serum Institute of India to help produce things. So there are other ways, like licensing. In fact, you can enforce licensing. And you can enforce licensing without sort of royalties and costs. I know also AstraZeneca was sending vaccines to developing countries at cost, and maybe the Pfizers and Modernas, who have been making quite a bit of profit, could also do that as well. So there's other ways to get around it. I think what you need to look at is pipelines, how quickly it gets up and gets produced, and whether coming off patent would actually do that, or whether there's bottlenecks like we had with the bottleneck in the EU, where trying to increase production of vaccine really slowed it down for Europe. Well, coming off patent wouldn't help that. You have to sort of look at these bottlenecks, look at the manufacturing, look at supply lines, look at collaborations that can maybe increase vaccine production, and looking at costs, maybe putting cap on costs, maybe getting the countries that are really producing a lot to export more. I think that's certainly an area that needs to be addressed.
So, Jennifer, first of all, thank you for sharing. I'm encouraged to hear that there are already mechanisms in place to mitigate some of these potential problems. But in a way, I'm even more confused that why was this apparently in the media such a dispute between America and Europe about this patent issue, when it sounds like it shouldn't have been such? I mean, it should have been, why aren't we focusing on solving that problem around the things that really matter?
I mean, I guess patents, you are giving a monopoly to the group that own the patent. So they're the only ones that can produce it. And that can sometimes be a bottleneck. I'm just saying that sometimes the solution isn't necessary to take it off patent, because the patent in itself isn't enough. You have to have all the know-how, which could be years of work behind it to be able to make a good, safe vaccine. And there's concerns that if people are allowed to make it, there's no patent stopping them, then what is the efficacy or safety of those vaccines?
I get it. So a few people wanted to come in. I saw Brian first and then Uli again. Brian, can you be unmuted? Can we unmute Brian? Brian's throat.
Good.
Are you unmuted, Brian?
Yeah, I am now. Okay, let me add my thoughts on this one, because as Angus pointed out, I was involved in writing a good number of patents. I think I had about 10 US patents to my name over the last 30 years or so of my career. Patents are used to make money and protect people. This is the game. But at the end of the day, I had a chat with my wife the other evening exactly about dropping the patents, because she's a qualified European patent attorney. She's working in this business now for 10 years. So the money question, I think that there's so much money wasted on other things that could be much better put towards solving this vaccine issue. I think dropping the patent protection for a period of time or longer to enable other countries to manufacture, but the trick there is to still be able to do this under proper good manufacturing practice. Everything has to be sterile. It has to be developing countries or countries who don't have the expertise, they're going to have to be shown how to do this properly. So some people, they'll have to be traveling, people will be shown how to do this properly, so they come up to the standards. In principle, it's not that difficult. It's just the trick is, the problem is the formulation part with the liposomes in the case of Pfizer and Moderna. This is a messenger RNA which is formulated in a liposomal particle. And in the case of Pfizer, requires cold storage -80, which is a big shipment issue. And at the moment, most flights around the planet are booked just shipping vaccines. It's actually hard to ship samples from US to Europe or China for other projects, drug product manufacture, for instance, in other areas, simply because there's such an issue with this. I think if you see the money that's going towards this project, flying to Mars and the likes, there's an enormous sums of money being used by private individuals, companies, which could be better spent on solving, as everybody points out, a global problem. This virus is not particularly deadly. It's just very relatively infectious. And some people get very sick from it and have long-lasting problems. It's not simply like a flu where you get over it most of the time. So plenty of people who have issues, maybe just weak immune systems or have other underlying issues, where this becomes a major problem. And I think we need to, globally, we should put money in a big pot and make sure that everybody has a chance to be vaccinated, because, we can't split the planet up and say, okay, we have what's called third world and the elite who can afford to be vaccinated. It is not right.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Brian.
Get rid of the virus in a uniform way over the entire planet. There should be no barriers as to who can have vaccine and who not. It's a logistical problem. It's expensive, but we spend lots of money on other things, haven't we?
Yeah, and there was the precedent with smallpox, of course, that it was eradicated at a global level. Let me just bring in Uli. You've your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on this patent issue also. I mean, I can only agree with what was said now. If we just think of what the lockdowns cost us and what in fact the tests cost us, right? A COVID test, and in many countries we are testing the entire population over and over again, is more expensive than a vaccination. But obviously the vaccination is going to have more of an effect. So what really, I don't think we need to get cheaper on the vaccination, but by really getting rid of the patent, but rather, I'm surprised that a lot of big pharma companies with a lot of expertise are actually not pitching in to help produce. So if you're just looking at Novartis, for example, where I happen to know it, I think Roche is another example, they are not producing vaccines, right? Because in fact, they're producing protease inhibitors, small compounds that they think they will have on market in 8 years to have an alternative way to treat COVID. And of course, they wouldn't have a drug development running that is ready in 8 years if they vaccinate it away now. It doesn't make sense for them. So I think what we should rather do is have incentives for those who can produce to actually produce, and the licensing would probably not be the problem, right?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of good comments as well. I see coming in the chat. My apologies when I can't keep up sometimes with what's going on in the different areas, but I largely agree. I mean, I think Uwe also made some good points. I mean, there's often danger that populism's involved. We get back to the competition between countries. I suppose it is partly a problem. I think Brian said it very well, that it's a matter of expertise, and we have to make sure that the capacity and expertise is not held back in areas of the world for reasons related to short-term focused economic, short-term considerations. Nicole, I see you have your hand up. Would you, and then Giorgio again.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment to the big pharmas not helping produce. I think that's not quite true. It's exactly what's happening. So Sanofi will be producing, I think, the BioNTech vaccine as well. Then Bayer is going to produce the CureVac vaccine that we are expecting to be admitted in the EU probably in June. Then also Novartis will be producing one of the vaccines that are on the market. So they are jumping in. Of course, they're making some money from it, but they're exactly using their capacities and their knowledge and know-how to set up the production and to help produce. So we're seeing something that I don't think it has ever happened in this way, shape, or form before. And that's not being prevented by patents, because obviously the patent holders are allowing them to produce or helping them to set up. So we're not going to have a lot of vaccine produced by just lifting the patents, because you need the know-how, and just the fact that it takes a company like Sanofi, who's really well experienced in vaccines, several months to get that production going shows you it's not trivial to produce. It might sound trivial, it would be easy in the lab. I mean, all of us could do it in the lab, but to make it a safe and efficient vaccine is a totally different story. So I think this lifting the patents was a political thing.
Yeah.
And this is also why Europe is pushing back, because they don't see it's going to help. And I think it was a political move by Biden to do that.
I certainly think we shouldn't demonize pharma companies because we depend on them. And I didn't mean to imply that. I think there are issues about how these debates are conducted at a political level. I think as a society of scientists and educated people, we should try to contribute to these debates to make sure that the facts are there and properly discussed. Giorgio, let me bring you in. You had your hand up.
Yeah, so I found extremely interesting that this whole pandemic has revealed a bit of a paradox when it comes to medical research in a way, right? Because we are all very familiar with the fact that basic research is normally financed by the public money, right? So we all have experience in the EMBL, but basic research is largely, almost exclusively, I would say, financed with public grants money. But then we completely fail in terms of society to then do the second step, which in fact is actually probably the easiest, because if we think about the vaccines that we have now, it's clear that they all build on decades of public research, whether it's the mRNA vaccine or whether it's the adenovirus vaccine. None of it could have happened without public research in university research institutes. The research aspect is financed by the public, but the development aspect is completely left to the free market. And I wonder whether there is something to learn there, which can give at the same time, move the threshold a little bit farther so that we actually, the public takes ownership of the whole process, if not for all drugs, obviously, but at least for some drugs which are, either future and non-existing at the moment. So it could be emerging disease, or drugs that don't have a market that is particularly appealing to companies. That could be the starting point. Seeing something like a CERN of public health would really be a victory in this sense.
Well, maybe the closest we get to that is EMBL, as one of the world's leading organizations for promoting excellence in basic science. And in fact, we're almost out of time. But in fact, you've just given a perfect segue as a finishing point, where I wanted to, again, just remind and highlight for people that I think one of the fantastic things we've learned from this year of Coffee with EMBLs, this is the 14th such event, is for me, I've already learned an enormous amount. And I thank all of the speakers, everyone who's contributed today. Thanks to Ari, Peter, Thomas, Giorgio, everybody else who's contributed. It's been very educational for me and very stimulating to be able to explore in such a good way these important topics. I think there's a lot more we need to discuss. we have plans in place. Thomas has been very active. I'd like to thank that and a number of the other members of the community. I'd like to invite everyone who would like to contribute and help. We are hoping to launch later this year a YouTube channel. This is deliberately Coffee with EMBL for the community of EMBL alumni and staff and invited guests. But we think there's a valuable thing we can help to do to take directed discussions like this, educational short videos, which are very fact-based, apolitical in terms of not propagating a nationalist view or the views of a particular party, but just talking about facts and exploring issues. And we want to take that as a platform to help to provide a reliable, trustworthy source of information that's accessible to the public to help communicate on some of these very important topics as we've been discussing today. I'd like to bring in Sigrid, who's got her hand up. Sigrid, are you able to?
Yeah. Hi, I just wanted to mention a couple of resources. One is that I belong to a research group called COVERT. So it's the COVID-19 International Research Team. That was started actually from analysis working groups that I work for NASA, and we have analysis working groups for our bioinformatic analysis of our gene lab data. And we have people that have helped us with analyzing that data from spaceflight, and that group actually then just evolved into, once the pandemic hit, people with bioinformatic knowledge taking data that was accessible mostly through Chris Mason at Weill Cornell, who had access to patient data. And so that is an ongoing effort. And actually, the meeting overlaps with this one. I'm missing it right now. But there's a number of focus groups in that conglomerate. It's now a very big international team. So I just want to put the link to that, and anybody is welcome to join that who would like to participate. Also, one other resource that I listen to a lot is TWIV, This Week in Virology. And there's actually a number of different This Week in Immunology, et cetera. And a lot of them were actually focusing on the coronavirus and researchers discussing a lot of the same issues that were discussed here today. So I just wanted to point those out to people who might be interested in following those or participating in our international research team.
Thanks a lot, Sigrid. Deep thanks to everyone for taking part. I really look forward to seeing you again at future Coffee with EMBL events. And please do think of contributing to the alumni organization. And if anyone's interested in helping us as we go forward with plans for the EMBL Alumni Back to Basics YouTube channel or initiative, we really want to help take the message to the wider population, and especially to our governments and funding agencies, that basic science is absolutely critical. We have to keep a broad base of excellent basic science, because we don't know where the next crisis or solution to the crisis will come from. Very few professional, I'm sure Peter Rottier can testify to this. With due apologies, coronavirus research wasn't necessarily the one that automatically was given the most funding in past years. And yet it suddenly became the most critical thing for us to know about. We don't know what the most critical thing to know about to solve the problems of the future will be. And I think it's critical, therefore, that we explain that in a way that is very graphic to our political masters. We must maintain a broad base of excellence, spread and disseminate that information, and build networks at a global level, and make sure that we are prepared through a broad base of excellent basic science for any future problem that arises. That would be my view, and I suspect that of most of the people here. So once again, thanks to everyone for taking part. I hope you enjoyed today, and I look forward to seeing you again at future events. Thank you very much.